Hello everybody and welcome to my presentation about dying languages, the influence of prestige on a language. So what part plays prestige on sustaining a dying language? First of all, let's look at the contents of my presentation. We look at a broad overview of all the endangered languages, and then we're going to look at endangered languages in general, containing language death. Why should one save a language? When can one speak of a dead language? And language shift. Then I'm going to tell you my specific focus of my investigation, what was my gain, what were my questions, and afterwards we're going to look at prestige of a language, an everyday perspective. What do people say about language, language death, and yeah. Then we're going to look at English, a global language, the first global language, lingua franca, and then we're also gonna focus on some factors of why people like a language. We're gonna look at from when on can one speak of sustaining a language, and then the conclusion comes. What was the conclusion of my work? Answering my questions, and the sources. Yeah, there. The sources are always there. So, first of all, the language hotspots. So you can see this is the world with the threatened hotspots. Where are the language mostly threatened, and you can see the severity with the colors. But this is only like a broad overview that you know that there are a lot of endangered languages around the world. So, language death. So, people may be aware that languages are dying, but have no idea at what rate. So, people who don't possess awareness of language death will most likely end up realizing the problem when it is already too late. The government can pump as much money into language projects as they want. If people don't realize that the language is dying, there is little chance to prevent the unavoidable death. According to the Ethnologue, there are 6,000 to 7,000 languages on our planet. There are 50% are predicted to die out until 2100. The number of languages are problematic because there is a great divergence between linguists of what can be seen as a language and what is merely a dialect. And I've got two examples here. One is the Bosnian and one is Norwegian. In Bosnia there was a war in this region, and the Yugoslavian region, so that they discerned the languages. They couldn't say we speak the same language and it's merely a dialect, but they wanted to say I've got my own language. And also if you look at Finnish and Norwegian, in this area it actually looks pretty much the same, but you can never tell Norwegian that it's the same as Danish or Finnish. Okay, and also this example, most minority languages, yes, of the world, 96% of the world's languages are spoken by 4% of the world's population. This is kind of crazy because we think we have a lot of languages, 7,000 languages, and 4% of the people speak 96% of the languages. So this is kind of severe. And as I've already said, 50% are predicted to die out. So why should one save a language? There are several reasons. You can think of the culture, heritage, and identity. So where do I come from? This is my culture, my ancestors. Or you can think of linguistic diversity. so that we have a great variety of linguistic diversity on our planet. Also tradition, this is always as it has been, it may not die out. Also there's a reason like knowledge, knowledge of animals. There are kind of stems who have knowledge about animals and plants and medicine, and if the language dies out, all this knowledge dies with it. Of course, there are personal factors and much more. So let's continue. So when can one speak of a dead language? A language is said to be dead when no one speaks it anymore, according to Crystal. So does this mean that a language is still living when at least two people speak it? I mean, two people. Maybe one can say that the chances are small for a few speakers that the language will probably die out, and for larger communities with thousands of speakers, it can still be endangered. The language can still be endangered despite its present use. It's always depending on the prestige of the language. Is this the lower language, or how does the economic situation look like? And also, according to Crystal, population size alone is not an accurate indicator of language situation. There can be a large population, but there is a higher standard language, and this has a higher prestige, so the language is still endangered. This example of sorry for my my pronunciation. Australia had 100 speakers 1963, which were 35 years of age average. People were 35, and there was a first language. 30 years later, only 6 speakers remained, whereof they were 65 plus minus of age. And there were some younger people who understood the language, but it didn't really help. Okay, so let's look at language shift. What is language? What kind of language shifts are there? There are political, economic, and social factors, and also demographic factors. So an example would be that a taxi driver in Johannesburg, South Africa, was able to speak 11 languages, what is kind of astonishing. But however, his main ambition was to earn enough to enable all his children to learn English. None of the other languages ranked highly in his esteem. So actually, he was able to speak a lot of languages, but his children, he wouldn't teach his children another language, but English, because the economic is really important. It's really important to learn the language for the economy, for in order to find work and earn a living. So my specific focus of investigation. So I have posed a few questions I want to answer, and this is kind of my research. What effect has desirability, prestige on a language? What can be done to improve it? If the prestige of a language is promoted, is it possible to save the endangered language of its death? So those are the questions I've asked, and I'll try to answer them. Prestige, desirability of language, and everyday life perspective. The Röstigraben in Switzerland, French is actually an official language, but in the German-speaking parts, there are a lot of people who don't like French at all. So French is not desirable in this regions. I also had a personal experience in the military where French people were very distant to the German-speaking people. One can say if a language possesses a bad reputation and therefore has a bad connotation, it is most likely that it's not going to be spoken in that specific area. So this can even be seen as one of the factors why Switzerland maintains four national languages instead of one national language. So French is not going to be spoken here, and German is not going to be spoken in the French part, according to the Röstigraben. When I ask some people who appreciate French why they do so, it is either because they are bilingual or they stated that they were good at it in school or they simply like the sound of the language. And this kind of raised the question for me, why don't people speak of the culture, heritage of their family, their ancestors, their identity, but they rather talk about the desire to speak the language. I think one reason is that people do not grasp what a language actually is and what it all entails. They either learned it as their mother tongue or in school. And there are also there's also music, books, movies, events. There are also motivational factors in order to study a language or to maintain a language. Music, there are bands, Nordic bands, and people like this Nordic feeling, and that's why they are motivated to learn the language. Or also Iceland, who had this World Football game, um, inspired a lot of people to study their language because they think the culture thing is really amazing, astonishing. It's cool, and that's why the people wanted to go to Iceland because they've seen the culture connect with the language. And yeah, it also depends on your working situation, of course, what prestige the language has, and your friends, if they like the language, and young people, is the language actually in? Is it out? And of course, what you do in your free time is really important. So, we have now spoken of some motivational factors, what they are in order to learn a language or why people like a certain language. But what is with the desirability of sustaining a language? In the case of Swiss German, Swiss people find it really important to discern High German and Swiss German. Swiss German has domains of its own, as in the working field or Swiss people in general socializing or having chats in Swiss German. But in the academic field, German, High German, clearly dominates. Thus, there is clearly a defined structure of what language is, where applicable. So, let's continue. This is a citation of Holmes, 2008. In 1974, a Chilean refugee family went to live in a small provincial New Zealand town where there was work but no opportunity at all to use their mother tongue, Spanish. Their 8-year-old daughter, Crystal, quickly realized that her knowledge of Spanish made her seem odd to her school friends, and she rapidly refused to use Spanish even at home. Language shift for Crystal was almost complete by the age of 13. She retained some understanding of Spanish, as example some passive knowledge, but she refused to speak it under any circumstances. So this is a nice example of a language that had a bad reputation, and that's why she didn't want to speak the language at all. So this is only one example, but we continue. I wanted to say something to the other language. Like this example is fitting to describe the desirability to speak a language. Although Spanish is not a national or spoken language in New Zealand, one can look at the motivation why she didn't want to speak the language. She didn't want to speak the language because of her friends. This is also what happens when a language dies out. The younger generation sees no reason why they should continue to speak their parents' language. Thus, one reason why languages are starting to die out is because they do not seem to fit the youth's standard. Now we look at English as a global language. A language achieves a genuinely global status when it develops a special role that is recognized in every country. And about a quarter of the world's population is already fluent or competent in English, and this figure is steadily growing. So English had a kind of economic development different to all the other language that were not global because America was not discovered, but languages that were all around the world like Latin or French or Greek. They were mostly connected to wars. The people made war, and that's why people spoke language. So actually language was not easy to learn. It was just because other people oppressed the other people. But with English we've got a rather different situation. It became the first global lingua franca. So, and because of the possibilities through technology, English became really important in an economical sense. And the poor people in the countries need to adjust to the economic language, as in the case of South Africa, as we have already heard, in a former example of this taxi driver, where the English language was really important for economical reasons. Okay. Let's look at some factors of why people like a language. The language is accepted and has no bad reputation, especially amongst the younger generation. And the strengths of language and its origin are highlighted and widely known. And of course, governmental support will also help. As the younger generation are the followers who speak the language, it is really important that there are no obstacles for the younger people to speak the language. If they don't speak it, the fact that they can understand it is not going to be enough to mediate it to their children later on. I think a speaker of a language understands and appreciates his language to a far higher degree if he understands the cultural inheritance. There are many facts about a culture that is conveyed to a little extent. As example, nice to know facts would foster the evoked the language's reputation, because a language that was just spoken is evoked to be the language of my ancestors. Hero figures can also promote a reputation of a language. Yes, if there's a hero of the language of this country, then it's more likely to be sustained if it's known. But from when on can one speak of sustaining a language? Supporting the prestige of a language is definitely going to add crucial benefits to the endangered language. Yes, this is an important point. And also, but all languages that are oppressed by external forces, example, government, dictator, have no chance to raise their prestige in such an environment, because there is no way people are going to look at the prestige if they're oppressed, or a dictator says no, we don't want this language, or even a genocide. Depends, or if it's racial also. But yeah, it's not. They're not going to keep on speaking the language. And this is my conclusion. I've got 4 points. People need to know how essential their linguistic background is, so that they can understand that the language is they need to speak the language for linguistic diversity and also identity. People speaking an endangered language need to be alarmed of how critical their language situation is. So if people don't know that their language is endangered, they're not going to do anything against it. So you can also do governmental support of the language, or there are many ways you can support the language. You can also alarm the people and or create apps for cell phone languages, or there are a lot of methods how you can foster the language and alarm the people. And there's also a need of an elucidation of their historical background, that they know what was their past, so that they can build a firm bond with the language, so that they just don't know I speak this language because I speak this language, but rather that they know I speak this language because of my ancestors, because of what they've all done. And if you connect with the history, you're more likely gonna be somebody's gonna like your nation, is gonna like your language, and you want to sustain it, and you don't want that it dies out. Of course, if there's no external force or anything in the way. The prestige of a language is rather irrelevant if oppression or economic reasons are playing a role. As again, the example of the taxi driver, if economical reasons are just higher, people just need to live, then it's not gonna work out. And this was my conclusion. I thank you very much for listening to my presentation, and those are my sources. So if you want to look it up, here you can look it up. Thank you very much.